Have you ever had that feeling that something isn't quite right, but you can't put your finger on it? That nagging sensation, like something's out of place, even when everything seems normal. Well, that's exactly how Michael felt when he moved into his new apartment. It was a charming place, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. But there was one thing that always bothered him. His neighbor, Mrs. Blackwell. Michael had only lived in the apartment for a week when he first met Mrs. Blackwell. She was an elderly woman, always sitting in her front window, staring out at the street with an unsettling intensity. One afternoon, Michael decided to introduce himself. She welcomed him with a smile that seemed a little too wide, and her handshake was cold, unnervingly cold, like touching the surface of a marble statue. In the days that followed, Michael noticed something even stranger. Mrs. Blackwell was always home. No matter the time of day, her curtains would always be drawn, but he could still see her silhouette in the window, staring out. She never seemed to leave her apartment, not even to buy groceries. And whenever Michael walked past her door, he swore he could hear soft whispers, almost as if she was talking to someone. But when he knocked, she would answer with a confused expression, as if no one had been there. One evening, Michael arrived home late, only to find Mrs. Blackwell's door wide open, but she wasn't inside. He stepped cautiously into the apartment, calling her name, but no answer came. The apartment was exactly as it always was, with everything in place, but something felt off. Then, in the corner of the living room, he spotted a strange old photograph, one he'd never seen before. It was a picture of a younger Mrs. Blackwell, standing in front of the very building they lived in, surrounded by a group of people. But what froze Michael's blood was the fact that he was standing in the photograph, in the background, looking exactly the same as he did now, only years younger. Michael could barely understand what he had just seen. His mind raced, but before he could process it, he heard a faint sound, a whisper coming from the back of the apartment. He turned around, only to find Mrs. Blackwell standing in the doorway, her expression vacant, almost lifeless. She whispered one word, "Leave," but it wasn't a plea. It was a command. Before Michael could react, she stepped back into the darkness and the door slammed shut, as if it had never been opened in the first place. The next morning, Michael couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to him. He decided to find out more about Mrs. Blackwell. He visited the building's old maintenance worker, Frank, who had worked there for decades. Frank seemed hesitant at first, but eventually, he told Michael something he could never have expected. Mrs. Blackwell had died over 20 years ago. Her apartment had been empty for years, or so they thought. Michael was the first person to move in since then. The truth was undeniable. Mrs. Blackwell had never left. She had been there all along, lingering in the shadows, watching from her window. That night, Michael decided to confront her one last time. He arrived at her apartment, his heart racing. The door creaked open, as if waiting for him. Inside, he found her, or what was left of her. The room was cold, her body frozen in place, eyes wide open, staring at the empty space where Michael had once stood. The air was thick with the stench of decay. To this day, no one knows what happened to Mrs. Blackwell. Her apartment was cleared out and the building was eventually sold, but every now and then, someone new moves in. And just like Michael, they feel the strange pull of the neighbor who never really left. The windows are always drawn. The whispers never stop. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe for more spine-chilling tales from the world of the unexplained. Stay safe. And remember, sometimes the people you think you know may not be who they seem.